Okay, we'll get started. Hello, my name is Tom Dean, and along with Laura Rigal, our speaker tonight, we have created and co-organized the Iowa Literary Heritage Series, which is a new program that we're going to have a series of programs twice a year focused on a book or an author or a topic in Iowa's literary heritage. And for our first series, we focused on Phil Stong, who is the author of State Fair, and we had a discussion of State Fair, the book, and we screened all three versions of the film, and this is the final event in that series. It's a talk not on State Fair, but on Phil Stong's other work. This is yeah, as I said, we've had enough of Ma Freak's mincemeat, I think, for for one season. The title is Beyond the Winning Pig, Phil Stong's Other Animal Tales, and Laura Rigal will be presenting tonight, and she is an associate professor of English and American Studies at the University of Iowa. Her publications include A Cultural History of Philadelphia and numerous articles on 18th and 19th century U.S. history and culture. So we thank Laura for doing that. We thank the Iowa City Public Library for being our partner in this, and Maeve Clark is here tonight, and her help, Beth Fisher, has been of tremendous help in our programs as well, so we thank them very much. So, Laura.
Someone's going to turn the lights down, they said, so I don't know. It's on a machine. Oh, that's cool. I think I can still read from here.
Can you see?
I think I can. Is there a little bit better light, maybe? Oh, that's perfect. There we go. I don't know what that was, but that's...
It's magic.
Yeah. Well, as Tom said, this is our last installment on a series of talks in relationship to Phil Stong, and we've been focusing on State Fair. And I thought, I don't know if everyone in the audience actually knows the plot of State Fair, and I don't want to bore you with it in any detail, but it's about a farm family, the Frakes, who drive up from the far southeast corner of Iowa all the way up to the fairgrounds in Des Moines, which is a northwestern trek. And it's about their experiences at the fair. It's really his most popular and commercially successful book. Published in 1932. This talk is supposed to be about Phil Stong's animal tales, and you'll see that there are indeed animals in my talk. But I've actually altered the title of the talk, and it's now Beyond the Winning Pig, Phil Stong's Historical Fiction for Children. Because the more I got to know about his children's literature, his juvenile fiction, the more I realized that what really held it all together and related his children's literature to his adult fiction was his really profound investment in this tiny, tiny little community in southeast Iowa and its very specific history. So I started to really look into that, and that's really what my talk's about today. So up till now, I'm going to read this because there's 60 slides, which are going to go pretty fast. So I think reading it will make a lot more sense than trying to just verbalize at will. Up until now, our focus has been solely on Stong's most popular and commercially successful book, State Fair. Tom and I have talked a lot together about this novel and about the 3 movies made from it. Tom bravely attended all 3 screenings, but I could tolerate only 2. The movies made from State Fair actually began to tire me by the 3rd screening. However, reading the book proved to be a very different experience. I find Stong's novel easygoing, easy to read, but I also found it curiously satisfying and worth returning to a second and even a 3rd time. The readers Tom and I have encountered in our discussion group describe the novel State Fair as comparatively light and amusing, a nostalgic depiction of the easygoing, prosperous Frake family who traveled to the State Fair in the midst of the Great Depression. While Stong makes a few snide references in State Fair to banks, farm mortgages, and railroads, the characters in his book seem almost completely untouched by the farm crises that roiled Iowa agriculture during the 1920s and 30s. There's little registration of the bleak economic condition that threatened agrarian Iowa, as the likable Frake family leave their Van Buren County farm on a moonlit drive up the Des Moines River from Van Buren County to the big city, Des Moines, and the big fair. Of course, State Fair strikes readers as light reading because it is an entertaining book about a great rural American entertainment, the 20th Century State Fair. But the plot is also interestingly streamlined. The novel is rather elegant and spare, economical perhaps in its deployment of language, character, and setting. In fact, the plot was so streamlined, slick you might say, that it slid seamlessly into a screenplay followed by 3 movies, the first made in 1933, using actual footage from the Iowa State Fair of 1932. There is something else worth saying about Stong's book, however, and this is my point of departure for thinking with you today about Stong's children's books. All of Stong's most popular and readable works of fiction, including State Fair and including his books for children, are deeply, if not obsessively, rooted in one way or another in the author's own childhood in Van Buren County, Iowa, in and around the tiny towns of Pittsburgh and Keosauqua. I forgot to go through these slides. These are adorable slides. This is State Fair as a side, but this is from the film, from the 1933 film. This is the map, and I just want you to see where Van Buren County is, way down near Missouri, very early part of Iowa to be settled in the 1830s. Stong's father ran a general store in Keosauqua, and just down the road, Stong's maternal grandfather, George Duffield, presided over a 400-plus acre farm called Linwood. His father's general store was clearly important to Stong as a scene of sociability and a point of connection to the outside world. It also must have taught the writer something about the arts of sales and advertising and about the expanding universe of 20th century consumer culture, which arrived with the cars and movie theaters of the 1920s. The small-town general store is treated nostalgically in State Fair and several of Stong's other adult novels. In his historical fiction for children, like Young Settler, however, set in 1837, the general store is a frontier trading post run by a fur trader who buys deerskin from the local Sauk and Meskwaki in a social environment that is not at all the white Euro-American family farm, and is instead a place where one might meet strangers, some of whom speak languages other than English, like French or Meskwaki. I handed out a sheet that has all of Stong's publications listed, and you'll see that he wrote nearly as many juvenile fiction, works of juvenile fiction as he did adult fiction, and I would just peruse that at will. This is the cover of Young Settler. I'm just going to very briefly go through a few images from this kind of fabulous and strange book about settler colonialism in Van Buren County. And just bear with me while I kind of sketch the plot. This is about a boy with a horse. The boy's name is High, and his father gives him the family horse named Nellie. High changed Nellie's name to Euclid. This is amusing. High's feeling about running errands on Nellie and harnessing, grooming, and feeding her changed immediately. High sought for something to do for his father in return for giving him the horse. Mr. Ellison was a surveyor, and his favorite book was called Euclid, for a man who wrote geometry. He's a surveyor, and Euclid is the name, obviously, of the geometry genius who stands behind the incredible grid that gets laid over Iowa and the former Louisiana Purchase. This is a classic, right, frontier scene where we've got High and his family leaving Ohio and going out to Iowa. This is where High meets the trader who's in this area, the fur trader, who is presently in this economic relationship with local Meskwaki. And this is kind of what I want to underline about these works of fiction. They're full of Meskwaki words, real ones, and although at times Stong refers to them as Sauk. Sauk and Meskwaki are related, but not identical languages. But here, one of them began, Netapanani Kugwachisawa, when the trader interrupted. So you laugh. So that's what you mean. He attempts to fly on his horse. there's more that goes on. High makes very good friends among the local Sauk and Meskwaki, and during this period it was Sauk and Meskwaki that lived in Van Buren County still. And throughout the book, High is referred to as Chimokemon, which is Meskwaki for white person. They get to be really good friends, but in this scene, these boys insult High and tell him that he can't go with them to fight the Sioux. And indeed, the Meskwaki and the Sauk were in constant combat with the Sioux during this period. Sauk and Meskwaki are Algonquian speakers. Sioux, obviously, like the Iowa, are Sioux and very different people. So these guys get in a big fist fight. And the father comes out. Actually, it's the uncle, I'm sorry. Pachika is his name. And he hits the two Indian boys. But the two Indian boys say to High, he says he will not beat you. He says that he has sorrow for you, that every day you must wear all clothes, even when the sun is hot, that you must do women's work in the garden most of all, that you have no uncle to show you what is a good way to act. He says he would not at any time have anything to do with you, a Sioux. I'm not a Sioux, High said desperately. I'm a Sauk. Pachika understood this. He waited for a moment, thinking deeply, and then he picked up the stick again. High had never waited for a whipping so eagerly before in his life. Pachika spoke a few quiet sentences. He says, in that case, he will beat you. He did not know you were a Sauk. He says you must have had it in your mind at all times to act like a good Sauk. You must have it in your mind at all times to act like a good Sauk. Now he will beat you. He doesn't beat him very hard. He gently does it. And the phrase at that point is, High had experienced much worse whippings from his father. And that it was which is of course a real classic problem for white farm boys in this state, that being beat by your white farmer father is extremely commonplace through the 20th century, actually. So anyway, High goes on to win the admiration and love of his kind of adopted family. He's not quite adopted yet, but he will be. In this case, he outruns an evil fur trader from St. Louis who wants to gyp the Sauk and the Meskwaki of their furs. And in the final episodes in the book, he's adopted by the Meskwaki and the Sauk in the area, who do not, in this book, have to leave. They're living next to each other. This new settler family and the Meskwaki and Sauk who are in the area. This was actually a classic kind of situation of contact across eastern Iowa during the 1830s and into the 40s. So it's not an unusual story. It ends happily with this adoption, and of course it's a children's tale, it's a fantasy. I'd like to spend a little bit more time here on some of a small group, actually, of covers of Stong's other children's books. In addition to his father's general store, another local setting undergirds Stong's writings for children, and that is the rolling landscape of his maternal grandfather, George Duffield's farm, down the road from Pittsburgh and Keosauqua on the Des Moines River. As a child, Stong spent hours and hours of his time, if not entire summers, on Linwood Farm, exploring, riding, and tending animals, doing farm work, and fishing or swimming in the creek with his two male cousins under the eye of Grandpa Duffield and the hired man. In fact, like the general store, the hired man was another rural Iowa type that had, by the 1930s, become increasingly rare as agriculture industrialized in Iowa and tractors substituted for horse and wagon, and New Deal farm subsidies took agricultural land out of production. As I began to learn about Stong, he was a confirmed alcoholic, by the way, on and off the wagon through his entire adult life. What began to impress me was the fact that at least half of Stong's 41 books and a larger percentage of his children's books were set in or deeply indebted to the historical landscape of Van Buren County, and more specifically to the Duffield farm on the Des Moines River, near Keosauqua, Pittsfield, and Brunswick, Iowa. This is the inside cover of this book, Farm Boy, and you can see the Duffield Farm, Linwood, back there. There's also swimming hole, Indian mound, farm. This is the Des Moines River, and this is the train to Pittsburgh, which in the book is called Pittsfield. Stong was nothing if not prolific. He wrote fast and easily. Of his 41 books, he produced 29 of them between 1933 and 1943. These were the 10 years that followed the huge success of State Fair, when Stong tried to replicate the commercial success of his first book, which he never really did. On the list of his books, which you hold in your hand, at least 8 of Stong's adult novels, 9 works of children's literature, and 4 of his nonfiction books either centrally involve or are indebted to the very local history of Van Buren County, with its town of Pittsburgh, fictionalized as Pittsfield, and its county seat, Keosauqua. Stong's literary output is deeply indebted to the white settler history of southeast Iowa, specifically Van Buren County. Not only State Fair, but almost all his works of children's fiction open on Grandpa Duffield's 400-acre farm called Linwood in real life. Significantly, in 1832, when money started rolling in from State Fair, Stong would use his profits to buy back his maternal grandfather's family farm, even while Stong himself lived in and remained in Connecticut after 1933. Stong owned Linwood Farm until his death until 1956. Originally, Stong's grandpa, Duffield, had purchased Linwood Farm back in 1843 with the gold he dug in California as a 49er during the gold rush years. A dyed-in-the-wool humorist who identified implicitly and explicitly with Mark Twain, Stong took a certain pride in the fact that just as Grandpa Duffield had purchased Linwood Farm with gold from California, so Stong likewise would purchase the same 400 acres with gold from Collywood following the success of State Fair, almost exactly 100 years later. Not only in State Fair, but many books thereafter, Stong returned imaginatively to settler history and the historical legacy of the Duffield Farm, especially in his juvenile fiction for boys, which he frankly admitted he wrote for the money. Most of these books, there's a small little group of them that I'm covering here. These books, along with Farm Boy, mostly involve a city boy from Des Moines who travels down to Van Buren County to visit relatives on this farm, which is always Duffield's family, the Duffield family farm. The city boy, in Farm Boy, the city boy brags about the Des Moines Zoo and Ingersoll Amusement Park, which were these sort of landmarks in Des Moines, until he really learns what real adventure is like on this farm. This goes for every one of these books. These are the most popular of his books, and he went to and visited with libraries and librarians who never wanted to hear about his adult fiction, always wanted to hear about his children's books. And these were the most popular. They were combined in the early 60s into a large, big book, it was called, Phil Stong's Big Book, which contained Farm Boy, No Sitch the Hound, and High Water, the Donkey Story. These 3 books are a kind of collection. There's also The Hired Man's Elephant. This is where I started actually learning about Stong, because this was this incredible narrative about a circus elephant who winters on a fictionalized version of the Duffield family farm in Iowa through the middle of a winter, this elephant. It's called The Hired Man's Elephant, so it's about a hired man and this elephant. Instead of Blue Boy the pig, it's a huge elephant. So here's a close-up of the farm, and I want to just this will be the only other book I look at in much detail, but this is the plot of Farm Boy. It's very simple, but you can see it's subtitled A Hunt for Indian Treasure. So it's another book in which Stong revisits and considers the sort of legacy of Native people, indigenous people in this corner of Iowa. What happens when the city boy arrives and meets his 2 cousins? There's always 2 cousins or 2 relatives, just like in Phil Stong's own life. He had 2 cousins that he played with. The hunt for Indian treasure, he gets to the farm, and immediately the grandfather, who's a well-known collector of Indian artifacts, it turns out, says, "Why don't you go dig in the Indian mound back in the back?" It turns out not actually to be an Indian mound. The hired man does this bizarre thing, and it's truly bizarre. He hides pieces, artifacts from the grandfather's collection back in the so-called Indian mound so that the boys can discover them. Eventually, the grandfather finds out, and it's all kind of a joke, but it's a very strange joke, and I'll explain why in a little while. Here's part of the fantasy of how these are real arrowheads. I guess Grandpa will be glad to get one of these. I never heard of Indians making arrowheads just to look at. He thought again, gee, there's pictures and statuaries in the historical building. This is in Des Moines, the Historical Society. Just to look at. Same thing, I bet. I bet, Guy said. Grandpa ought to give us a dime a piece for this arrowhead. And they find an axe, and they show it to Grandpa. But when they showed the club to Grandpa at supper, he acted rather queerly. He studied the club and studied it. Isn't it real? Asked Carl. Yes, it's real, said Grandpa. It's a little too real. Turns out it's a Ute war club. Big deal, but I think I'll read this. As the shadows closed down, Grandpa thought he could almost see the lean-tos and the teepees in the grove, and smell the smoke from the cook fires, and see his friends, Meskwaki and Sock and his playmates of almost 80 years ago dancing among the shadows under the trees. From behind, he heard the shouting of the boys as they ran around Linwood Lawn, and he nodded and smiled. Red or white, it doesn't make much difference once they get their toes against the dirt. At the Indian mound, he dismounted, and after a few moments, found the boys whole. Mighty funny, he thought. If there's anything in this mound, it must be anyway 30 feet in, but the boys have worked hard. He took the spade and made a few strokes. Almost at once, he heard a rustling. Sounds like paper, he thought. What have these boys got here? He knelt and dug in with his hands and immediately made the biggest discovery of all. He found a Navajo blanket from New Mexico, and the Indian that put it there had thoughtfully wrapped it in that week's issue of the Keosauqua Republican for Grandpa. In the 1930s, native arts, of course, were coming into the commodity market, and this reflects that. These stories are not without their seriously problematic aspects. Nevertheless, if you'll bear with me, I think you might find out some of the slightly more complicated aspects of these tales. Since I find the local, historical, and environmental settings of Stong's fiction to be among its primary interests, I was gratified to discover that John T. Frederick, the editor of the Midland Literary Magazine, the journal that helped put Midwest regional literature on the map, shared my point of view. Frederick published Stong's very first work in the Midland, a short story titled Hymenial, pronounce that, and kept in touch with Stong sporadically throughout Stong's career until his death in 1956. Frederick seems to have had no interest in Stong's books for children, but what he saw as unique about Stong's work was what attracts me. Its return again and again in the 1930s to the farms and tiny towns around Keosauqua at the hook of the Des Moines River where it meets Chequest Creek. The name Keosauqua means a bend in the river in the language of one or another of the indigenous groups, probably Sauk or Meskwaki, who lived in this locale before 1832, before the end of Black Hawk's War, and before the incursion of white settler families like the Duffields into southeast Iowa beginning in 1837. Stong's literary contribution, Frederick writes, was of major importance in the 1930s, and he has a distinction among our Iowa writers of having returned to the same town again and again in successive novels and stories until it is acquired through accretion of character and incident an assured and vigorous individual reality. The town in question is Pittsville, which is the fictional name given to Pittsburgh, Iowa, where Stong was born, just south of the Duffield farm. Pittsburgh figures again and again in Stong's fiction. The economic life of Pittsville, Frederick writes, is presented more fully by Stong than is that of any other Iowa town in fiction. You can see Pittsburgh here, but you can also see the Duffield farm here in Keosauqua in the hook of this river. What Frederick does not attend to, however, is that in addition to the local setting that shaped Stong's career, there were two important texts, specific historical and archival sources underpinning, if not grounding, his literary production of the 1930s, beginning with State Fair and emerging most obviously in Stong's historical fiction for children. The first of these sources is Stong's grandfather's published memoir, which contains rich descriptions of his experiences of contact as a settler child entering Iowa in the 1830s with the local Sauk and Meskwaki living in the lower Des Moines River Valley. When Phil Stong was just 7 years old, Duffield decided to write down his memories of arriving in Iowa from Ohio as a settler child. Duffield's memoirs were published in 1906 by the State Historical Society of Iowa in the Annals of Iowa, and they included his account of contact as a child with Sauk and Meskwaki living near his family's cabin along the river, where the Duffields had decided to settle in 1837, as, in fact, the first white settlers west of the Des Moines River, with the exception of a local fur trader named Crawford. Duffield's relative intimacy as a child with Sauk and/or Meskwaki children and adults living nearby are vividly, memorably narrated in Duffield's quite beautifully written memoir, which calls up a child's experience of settler life at a time when nationally the frontier had emerged as one of the great national myths of the colonial settler state, a great myth of founding circulating in books and early cinema, and at a time when the actual generation of white settlers of the 1830s was passing away. This is the frontispiece to Duffield's memoir, and I can't, of course, really read it to you. I'd like to. It is a really beautiful narrative. I can see why Stong sort of deeply internalized it, beautifully written. And I want to point out that in State Fair, there's an explicit reference to the Duffield memoir. Abel is the father of the Frake family, and they're driving to Des Moines to the fair, and Abel's driving home from the fair along the Des Moines River. Everyone's asleep in the car, and he's thinking, and he says, Abel drove on past Selma, Dowds, and Brunswick. These are actual little towns along the river, beside waters which would lick at the edge of his farm hours later. Abel liked the river. It made him think of Indians and the church tree, the great elm under which his grandfather had arranged the first religious services ever held in that part of Iowa. Of course, this is mythological stuff, but it actually also happened. This is the old church tree in Duffield's memoir along the Des Moines River. Under its branches gathered the first worshiping assemblage the Duffields attended in Iowa. In fact, this is also a site where Meskwaki and Sauk, and before that, Iowa and Illinois groups met for centuries prior to the Duffields. But the old church tree is actually a quite interesting presence here along the Des Moines River and referenced explicitly in State Fair. In 1906, and certainly when Stong was writing in the 1930s, the pioneer, the fur trader, and stories of contact with indigenous people were emerging in mass media, on film, in literature, and photography. In the 1930s, however, in Iowa, settler farm life, the rural and agricultural world that emerged from settler colonialism in Iowa, was not disappearing, or at least not disappearing as rapidly as it was in the more rapidly urbanizing northeastern United States. In the 1930s, the population of Iowa was still predominantly rural, by contrast with the rest of the United States, where by 1920 the line had been crossed. More people were living in cities than on the farm. In Iowa, the urban wouldn't equal the rural population until the 1950s. In addition, when Stong was writing in the 30s, Iowa was fast approaching its centennial year, 1939, and the push was on to capture the memories of a generation of former settler children, the youngest eyewitness pioneers who were now growing old and passing away like their settler parents before them. The New Deal 1930s was a great era for seeking out stories of all kinds, as you'll remember, including the narratives of white men and women living on farms whose work was still mostly performed by hand or with very simple machines, churning, milking, threshing. This is a book published at the same time by Madeline Horn, who's actually the wife of Ernest Horn, who founded the University Elementary School, and for whom Horn Elementary is named. His wife, Madeline, published several children's books, but this one is fascinating because they were friends with Grant Wood, and Grant Wood illustrated them. It's in this book that I think you really see the farm folk created in this 1930s mode, and there are 8 really quite remarkable illustrations. They were eventually gathered together in the late 30s and on display in New York. So I just wanted to show you this kind of creation of the Iowa farm folk in these images. This is the kind of narrative that Stong was also participating in, although not with the kind of remarkable art of Grant Wood, I would say. This is a guy who gets sprayed with milk when he tried to. He's a city boy. It's the same thing. A city boy on the farm, sprayed with milk. This is the grandma, of course, sewing the boy's jeans. It's quite, like all of Grant Wood's paintings, there's a kind of wit to each one of these if you pay attention. This guy is hilarious. Storytelling night, Grandpa tells stories. He looks both mean and amusing. And look at the rug underneath and the spilled popcorn. The details are kind of fabulous. The hired man, again, this figure of the hired man is all over this fiction of the 30s. Of course, as I said before, the hired man is really increasingly displaced during this period. The often single man who is employed for life, oftentimes on a farm, a large farm. This is the hired girl. This is even more significant in certain ways. She's preparing the thresher's meal, and at the same time, a few years earlier, before this book comes out, of course, Grant Wood paints his famous The Threshers, this huge canvas. I didn't include it here, but and it's on display, and it becomes famous at the State Fair in 1932. I think it's 1932. It's either 32 or 33. The threshers are displayed. Anyway, she's the person that does the labor for the threshers, and you get this in Grant Wood. And this is the very end of the book. It's the final one, and City Boy washes off the farm and heads back to the train. The 20s and 30s were also a time of intensified cultural study in the U.S. when anthropologists and educators were making collections of linguistic and ethnographic material assembled with or without permission from Native American groups who, like the first pioneers and the farm folk, seemed to be disappearing, at least from the perspective of outsiders. In the eyes of many white Americans of the early 20th century, indigenous people, too, seemed to represent a somehow more real or authentic way of life that, like Grandpa's farm, was also passing away. Crucially, and this is important for thinking about children's fiction, childhood itself, from the point of view of artists and educators of the 30s, also seemed to represent a fleeting but precious and authentic time of life, an epoch of real, true experience, as opposed to the modern, urban, industrial, increasingly mass-mediated and consumer-oriented, rather than producer-centered culture of the dangerous 20th century. In Iowa, one corollary to this set of interests in the authentic and fears of urban modernity was that elementary school education mattered, and especially mattered in southeast and south central Iowa, where the youngest students, elementary school children to be precise, were viewed by progressive educators of the era, especially those working at the University Elementary School at Iowa City, and public school teachers in Des Moines, as I'll point out, saw children as uniquely positioned to internalize and learn from the earlier historical and cultural materials of both the old settler generation and from the Indians, because childhood itself was a temporary and rapidly passing epoch, implicitly connected to a more authentic, if not more primitive, time of life. Children represented a unique opportunity for educating a younger generation in real-world problems from the point of view of progressive educators of the early 20th century, educating them in vocational, pragmatic activities as well as book learning in a curriculum that focused on the projects and problems, including economic problems, that shaped real human lives. It was this pragmatic orientation to active and productive life, often out of doors, that informed progressive ideals of public education in Iowa, and that to some degree inflected Phil Stong's popular fiction for children. Stong wrote his juvenile fiction mostly for money, which of course, after State Fair, was his primary motive for producing adult fiction as well. At the same time, Stong continued to draw repeatedly on the affective power and narrative art of his grandfather's memoir, for both his historical novel and for adult fiction like this, Buckskin Breeches, published in 1939. It's got exactly the same plot as Pioneer Settler, the first book that we looked at, same identical plot of contact. And in his children's books, which treat in fictionalized form actual historical narratives of contact with indigenous people and the fur trading and hunting economies followed by white settlement. Stong did research for his novels. In the case of Buckskin Breeches, beyond his children's fiction, this goes further than his children's fiction. In this novel, he checked facts with his old classmate, Frank Luther Mott, and with a history professor at Ohio State. He was more directly indebted, however, to Iowa's old settlers, as they called themselves. In 1936, Stong wrote to his friend Harvey Davis that he had just come back from Iowa, where he had spent a day searching through the county clerk's records for material for Buckskin Breeches. He writes, "I've had to do a good deal of semi-scholarly research on this yarn. But of course, I've gone chiefly to the vulgar sources, old settlers' reminiscences, etc., as representing to me most colorfully the spirit and conditions of the time. I've also used the word national in reference to Banks, even though the country was so little national that Michigan and Ohio at one time were talking of war, and very shortly after, Iowa and Missouri did declare war." In addition to the vulgar sources, his grandfather's and other settlers' memoirs, for instance, there was, in fact, a second major archival and historical source shaping Stong's settler stories for white children, a source which involved not his grandfather, but another member of his family, his Uncle Edgar Ruby Harlan, who from 1908 to 1937 was a director and curator of museum collections at the State Historical Society of Iowa in Des Moines. That's 1908 to 1937. When Grandpa George Duffield published his memoirs in 1906 in the Scholarly Annals of Iowa, he did so with the support of his son-in-law, Edgar Ruby Harlan. Moreover, as it turns out, as director of the State Historical Society, Harlan's primary, though certainly not his only contribution to its development, was his dedication to collecting indigenous artifacts from Native American groups west of the Mississippi, and especially from the Meskwaki people living nearby in Iowa at the Meskwaki settlement near Tama. Harlan made his collections in close consultation with the aid, and in most cases it seems with the support and permission of Meskwaki people with whom he established friendships and in relationship to whom he positioned himself as a student, a pupil. In the course of their relationship, the Meskwaki men with whom he worked performed an adoption ceremony, adopting Director Harlan into the tribe and giving him a name, which means snapping turtle. Actually, the name is Mashika. Furthermore, in the late 1920s, Harlan established something called the Indian Life School on his property in Altoona, today's East Des Moines. Here he brought Des Moines elementary school teachers to meet with older Meskwaki men and women, including especially Young Bear, George Young Bear, and Jonas and James Powashik. In the early 1930s, James Powashik built a village on Harlan's property, which was called, of course, Powashik's Village, for the purpose of meeting with and educating white visitors in the traditions and life of the Meskwaki. Of special interest to both Harlan and the Meskwaki was the goal of correcting popular white misconceptions about what it meant to be an Indian. Included among the elementary school teachers Harlan brought to Altoona were two female public school teachers, Hala Rode, initially Harlan's assistant, and a woman named Bessie Kuhn. As Harlan's assistant, Hala Rode helped to create many of the displays in the Historical Society Museum. Eventually, she became a third-grade elementary school teacher herself. Together with third-grade teacher Bessie Kuhn, she created a book on American Indian life for use by elementary school students and featuring pictorial and interpretive stories on various tribes. Clearly, both directly and indirectly, these educators and their students at the State Historical Society were in fact being educated by the Meskwaki. Here's some pictures from the Indian Life School. Oh, hi. Here's some pictures from the Indian Life School out on Edgar Harlan's property at Altoona. And there's a couple of episodes in which actually Harlan has the Meskwaki perform some of the very first powwows that they gave publicly. These are these female teachers, though, who actually went on to do the work of circulating this sort of Indian life educational material. This is at Powashik's village. This is a performance at the school, the Indian Life School, and this is the first annual powwow in Altoona. All of these photographs are from Jerome Christensen, who just retired as the curator in Des Moines at the Historical Society. I wouldn't have these without his incredible generosity. I just didn't know anything about Edgar Harlan, and he knew everything. So this is a quotation from a state fair then, in which we get direct allusions to what Stong experienced for over 30 years of his uncle's curating of this important historical society. This is the character Wayne. He's taking a trip from the state fair with his sort of seductive temporary girlfriend, and we get an urban outing. Wayne entered the crawling streetcar which rattled westward through Des Moines. After a long time, the car passed the two beautiful state buildings of Iowa, the Capitol and the Historical Building. A state with a history of less than 100 years had already begun to look back at its past like an intelligent child. Wayne guided Emily to a tiny gallery of pictures, and he led her to one which showed a white-haired man. "My great-grandfather," Wayne said simply. A gong sounded through the buildings, and they hurried out between groups of buffalo, deer, and wolves to the entrance. As regards Stong, who wrote fiction, it's important to grasp that his Uncle Edward Harlan's tenure as the director of the Historical Society unfolded during Stong's childhood and adolescence, and then during his college years at Drake University in Des Moines. Edgar Harlan was also a graduate of Drake. Moreover, Harlan's public education work at the Historical Society overlapped with Stong's short career in the 1920s as a reporter for the Des Moines Register, where Harlan published a series of articles on Meskwaki life and artifacts. Indeed, Harlan's tenure at the Historical Society overlapped specifically with the writing and filming of Stong's State Fair. It was Stong's familial and personal intimacy with the Iowa State Historical Society that explains the otherwise rather odd references to both the Historical Society and to his grandfather Duffield in State Fair. Stong's books of the late 1930s, Buckskin Breeches and Young Pioneers, focus centrally and specifically on Sauk and Meskwaki characters rooted in the settler colonial history of Van Buren County. They also deploy a quite remarkable number of Meskwaki words. In this regard, his fictions, while they certainly celebrate white settler colonialism, were inflected by the pedagogical practices of progressive educators, including those attending his Uncle Edgar's Indian Life School at Powashik's village. And, I would argue by extension, the handful of progressive educators in Iowa City at the University Elementary School, which in the 1920s and 30s was under the direction of progressive educator Ernest Horn, for whom Iowa City's Horn Elementary School is named. Like Edgar Harlan, Horn viewed himself as an educator not only of the public, but also, more immediately, of Iowa's public elementary school teachers. Horn would help innovate a curriculum at the University Elementary School that centrally involved what he too called Indian life. Horn's elementary school was called a model school or a laboratory school because it was visited by Iowa public school teachers and by university graduate students to learn the newest techniques in elementary education generally and in progressive curriculum specifically. Uniquely, the pedagogical projects of Ernest Horn at the University Elementary School centered on a curriculum that included a full year in second grade devoted to the language, culture, and economies, not just of the Indians in general, but of Meskwaki people nearby in south central Iowa. To create this curriculum, some of Horn's Iowa City teachers, like Harlan's female workforce in Des Moines, visited the Meskwaki settlement at Tama and Powashik's village on Harlan's property in Altoona in order to learn from the Meskwaki.
The university elementary school included a social studies curriculum structured under Horn's direction by excursions or field trips followed by class projects. It's a very specific progressive educational curriculum device to go out, take children out to learn, and to then have projects when they come back in. At the University Elementary School, the second grade social studies curriculum was devoted to what the school called Indian life. Later units in third and fourth grade then turned to problems and projects in pioneer or settler life. Under Horn, the second grade social studies curriculum on Indian life was not ethnocentrically devoted to the language, culture, and economies of disappearing or bygone Indians generically understood as the Indians. There was some of this, of course. But for second grade teachers at Horn's Elementary School in the 30s, like the third grade teachers who learned directly from Meskwaki elders at Edgar Harlan's Indian Life School, public school teachers and pupils were learning from and directly indebted to the knowledge and practices of Meskwaki people themselves, in relationship to whom these white progressive educators were in fact students. As public school teachers traveled to meet with Meskwaki teachers, and then Meskwaki returned these visits. The second grade Indian life curriculum in Iowa City is especially well exemplified by the career of Ernest Horn's graduate student Crystal Holmes, who was a second grade teacher at the school from 1934 to 1938. Holmes studied under Horn, where she developed a unit for teaching Indian history and culture. She wrote a report titled Activities in the Teaching of Indian History, describing what she and her classes were doing, including performing Indian dances, dyeing, building a teepee, making arrowheads, drums, costumes, etc. Completing her thesis in 1942, she dedicated it to Ma Ne To We Si, or Old Matusa, her friend at the Meskwaki settlement, who was 95 in 1936. James Powashik also made a bow and arrow for Miss Holmes. He and 6 other Meskwaki visited her on campus in 1938. She remembers that they laughed when they saw McBride Hall and the museum, where they wondered why the animals and the birds didn't move. Crystal Holmes traveled to the Altoona Village in Short, built by Jim Powashik outside Des Moines, as well as the Meskwaki settlement at Tama, to learn directly from elders there, both male and female. Finally, significantly, at Horn School in Iowa City, elementary school pedagogy and social studies involved these 2 core elements: excursions outside the school, followed by student projects using findings from an excursion to answer student questions and problems formulated ahead of time about the topic at hand. The progressive educators at the University Elementary School believed in a curriculum that focused on the real world of daily work and its problems, and made an effort to identify and develop student interest in knowledge that students already brought with them to class. At Horn School, a social studies curriculum using excursions and a project-oriented course of study involved 4 steps. The teacher first set up the topic, and second, listened to the questions generated by the students themselves. Third came the excursion or the field trip to find answers to student-formulated problems or questions. The fourth and final stage involved applying and representing in the classroom the answers discovered in a hands-on way by excursion and physical application in the classroom of answers discovered outside. Finally then, in addition to Stong's intimacy with the historical landscape of Pittsburgh, I'll stop. Let me just show you a few slides of these field trips taken by the University Elementary School. This one to the south side of Iowa City to Dane's Dairy Farm. I think these excursions in first and second grade are just kind of telling. These are the ones that deal, of course, with agricultural work rather than Indian life. These are from the special collections. These are all University Elementary School students. And here are these projects of planting. This sort of stuff goes on today, of course, learning. But then the projects these are older students in the University Elementary School, involved asking questions and then learning how to actually spin and weave. These are in the classroom, indoors. Here's pioneer weaving. Actually, in the elementary schools today, they still have weaving projects. You have to learn how to weave. See the ones on the floor, it's obviously a posed picture. Hardworking little students there. This is a crazy one. I think this is somebody that was well known in Iowa City, which is why this person gets a very big picture. Here's the Pioneer Assembly. So they played at being in a one-room schoolhouse. A little boy in the front with all those obedient, the dunce in the back. Yeah. Did you ever play dunce in school in your own childhood? I know I did. We had to face the wall though. We couldn't look like that. Here they are all reading like good girls and boys. And then they're standing up and reciting the recitation, which is what an archaic educational device now performed in the university elementary school. It's kind of something. Okay, my last few words. In addition to Stong's intimacy with the historical landscape of Pittsburgh, Keosauqua, and Linwood Farm, his uncle Harlan's 30-year career at the Iowa State Historical Society also shaped the ethical, public, and imaginative aspects of his fiction. In a sense, Stong was always, even in his adult fiction, writing about his Iowa childhood and the settler colonial roots of the Duffield and Stong families. His books for young readers, primarily boys aged 7 to 12, are simply plugged more obviously and directly into this source material. Stong frankly admitted that he produced his juvenile fiction for money at a time during the 1930s when he did little but drink and produce reams of often breezy rather than streamlined fiction. Nevertheless, his literature for children was inflected not only with the mass market, but also with the limits and the strengths of the place-centered, pragmatic, and open-air pedagogy of progressive educators in Iowa, including this child-centered curriculum at the State Historical Society, with its Indian Life School under the direction of Edgar Ruby Harlan, and in Iowa City at the elementary school with its Indian Life curriculum under the direction of Crystal Holmes, her Meskwaki teachers, and progressive educator Ernest Horn. Thank you so much for letting me deliver that to you. I hope it wasn't too tedious. I don't really know how to turn your lights on. Yeah, Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I especially like the way you weave together the cultural work of children's fiction with the pedagogical practices or aspirations of secondary educators. We're talking about biography and production and complicating the picture for us that help us see Strong's work beyond someone trying to produce something for money or just sort of thinking through his work as a way to sort of engage in nostalgia about childhood, that maybe there's some other layers that we can sort of think through in terms of the output and what the output of those stories means. I especially liked your discussion of the ways in which some of the things maybe that Strong was talking about found itself into the secondary curriculum. But the question that always comes up for me is, okay, what do people do with this? So obviously it's not in ethnography, but I don't know if maybe in other biographies or autobiographies, if there's anything that you're able to find about sort of the meanings that the children themselves are sort of making from not only those who read his books, but also like these projects and classrooms that they were doing and these field trips.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think we all could sort of think back to our elementary education.
Our creation as subjects of the elementary school.
Right.
Yeah.
And, oftentimes we have good fun, sometimes we learn about other cultures, but then did it translate to really thinking differently about indigenous people, the relationship to indigeneity, and so those are just some of the things that I was thinking about. And so I don't know if you are able to get at.
That is the question for this stuff, don't you think? That's the main question. And what I could have talked about more, I tried to talk about how childhood was being constructed in this period And really, the children, they were the little savages, right? They were also being. This was very much about them being used in some ways and being disciplined. I think I got a little sucked into reading the records of these women who did this labor. So part of my sort of in trying to pull this together, that was kind of the line I took. But I think that is a question I just have to sit with and think about. Do you have any ideas for me? Tom's always full of thoughts.
Well, the related kind of question or observation is that, at first when you were talking, I thought that actually he seemed surprisingly sensitive to Native peoples, especially for the 1930s, and it sounds like he got that from Harlan and Duffield, which is admirable. But at the same time, everything he writes about and then the curriculum that you discuss,
Absolutely.
Indians are historical artifacts.
Yeah.
And, it's
Yep.
all about and I imagine there wasn't, but was there any concern with Stong, certainly probably not the curriculum, about Native peoples
Personally.
then, today, what's going on with the contemporary
Yeah.
situation? Because in the 1930s, obviously, it was very different from 1830, 1837. But
Yeah.
even today, we have that issue, with a lot of education about, even as we study Iowa in fifth grade or wherever it might be now for a month, if Native peoples come up, it's as historical artifacts.
Well, that's a really important issue, and I'll tell you why I decided to go this way. Partly is, at the Meskwaki settlement last week on Monday and Tuesday, they had what they've had for several years now, like a 2-day seminar, about that, with a lot of speakers from Iowa City and from around Iowa, as well as Meskwaki. But it was one of these moments of cross-cultural learning that the Meskwaki actually are deeply participating in. So you can definitely, I'm well trained. It's my predilection to absolutely, right, kind of say, but you're museumizing. That's what I'm trained to say. That's the one thing I can say. I know how to say that. But in fact, what Mary Bennett over at I said that to Mary Bennett over at the Historical Society, and she said to me, I said, well, what does Jonathan Buffalo think about this stuff about Edgar Harlan? And she said, well, I think he's grateful, because she works with him. They're both historians, right? Jonathan Buffalo is a historian at Meskwaki Settlement. She said, I think he's grateful because at that time, there weren't very many Meskwaki preserving the culture. And now on settlements, but also on reservations, history making goes forward with these documents and these texts on behalf by Meskwaki or by Native people. And I think that's a real complexity. My graduate student, Steve Williams, wrote about this phenomenon, a Rocky Boy out in Montana, where Rocky Boy is having one of many kind of revitalization movements, and it involves history and producing their history. But the documents that they're using are primarily, they're collecting, right? They're collecting books to kind of create a library for their history. Same thing at Meskwaki Settlement. They have a library. Well, what are the documents there? A lot of them are these sort of what we would call ethnocentric anthropological texts. Nevertheless, that's what is material also for doing Indigenous history. If you're an Indigenous person, you still engage that material. So I think the complexity is so profound that I learned not to be as simplistic, which is not to say I really was kind of overly, I had to talk about Stong's children's fiction. So, like, what was I going to say? This was Stong. But
I think the aspect of interpersonal relationship with the tribe and the visuals you had were amazing, because it didn't appear like this was simplistic, plain Indian types of things that you see. So it wasn't that. Even with I think it was the uncle, right, who interacted with the Meskwaki.
Yeah. He was
adopted,
adopted.
et cetera. So I think that aspect was story that you're telling makes it more than just you're saying Indian cultural appropriation or teaching culture sort of absent of any other types of contextual factors going on. But at the same time, you know, especially talking about indigeneity and indigenous history, there is sort of this smooth talk about and teach about culture absent of displacement,
Oh gosh.
water rights, and
Oh my gosh.
environmental issues,
To say nothing of burial and
sexual exploitation, and all of these things. Okay, so we're talking about children's books. One of the things I kept thinking about in your talk was the work of Doris Lessing, African Stories, which is not a children's book, but many of the, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but many of those stories are talking about African indigenous people and their relationship, right, with
colonizers.
the colonizers, right? But there's such beauty about talking about really complex issues about racism, about displacement, despite interpersonal relationships.
Well, that's real literature, Deborah.
Right, real literature, not children's books. But
No, I get the point. Yeah.
Do,
Yeah.
and what I love so much about it, and oftentimes what we used to do is that in Iowa, I'll have my students take what we're learning in class and distill that, and as a project, make a children's book out of it. And so they have to think about, okay, how are we going to talk about these complex issues, like some of the things I just mentioned, in a children's book that's appropriate for ages, say, like, 6 to 9.
Wow, that's such an awesome assignment.
So
You're turning them into little progressive educators.
Yeah,
I'm teasing
some of
you.
the things I was just sort of thinking about, and maybe it just sort of follows through both with my first question, and I guess what's so amazing and provocative about your talk is it's both the, it's not the either or, it's like the but and, right? Just
Part of it
a lot to think about,
was
but-
really when you read a lot of the early material about contact. You know these are settler colonizers, but they're also one of the truths that ethnohistory about this period really communicates is the absolute interdependence of the absolute dependence of the white settlers on the native people, and the sort of loneliness of these situations where it's so hard for us to reconstruct, but they created relationships, and I get what Stong was picking up from these memoirs. These little, these people, these adults remembering when they were children, and the realities. There's this sort of affective, visceral quality to these materials that you cannot just dismiss. So I think I've read too much of that stuff. So it opens a kind of door for me to something that I wouldn't want to just cut off. I guess I'm getting old too, because I'm getting more sympathetic with the feeling that comes when you were a child settler and you're about to die, and you better write this down because your parents are dead. And this Duffield narrative was just profoundly moving. So I shouldn't go there, and I don't want to get sucked into nostalgia, and certainly that was a huge problem for all this progressive effort. But I'm also motivated by the kind of complete failures of our university to follow the best motives of these progressive educators and public educators. So, white and limited though they be, this kind of tradition is one of the better strains that we are living out if we're in this university. So, grappling with that progressive inheritance, we call it, many people are calling themselves progressives and not thinking through exactly what that means, but kind of pulling on this deep well of very mixed heritage from the New Deal. So anyway.
The interjection of language was really interesting.
Specificity of his books was unique.
And because I haven't read any of the books, but I noticed on maybe a couple of the slides, Indian was in quotation marks, which I thought was interesting. And then I'm always attuned to the visual as well as taking visual culture. A lot of times in children's books and artistry, the way in which they're represented is very sort of crude and stereotypical.
Yeah.
Another thing I noticed is that the art, though simplistic, did not sort of represent the kind of animalistic ways sometimes that indigenous people were drawn. So in its simplicity, there was like a realism behind the representation that I found interesting too, a way to sort of mark certain types of features without exaggeration.
You know where that comes from?
A lot of
That illustrator, I thought somebody would ask me, you were going to maybe ask me, Kurt Weiss, this guy who illustrated, he's not anyone from Iowa, he's from New Jersey, but he had a very complicated international background. He wrote and illustrated Ping, which is about China. He wrote several books about Australia because he was actually interned in Australia during World War II. Very strange background. But he illustrates lots of books that deal with international, non-U.S. Children and children's plots. But so there's something about him too that he sort of plays a part in the creation of these books. It's not, it's not just the writer, it's not just the prose. The illustrator's quite remarkable. There's very little on him, but I think he's quite wonderful, the illustrator. I think some of what you're picking up on has to do with his cosmopolitanism, probably, rather than his Americanness. He's not very American. Thank God. We should, Deborah, thank you so much for all of that. No, that's just great.